So today we come to the end of our journey through the book of Genesis. Remember that Genesis means beginning, and in Genesis we've seen the beginning of the world, the beginning of all life, specifically the beginning of humanity. Along with that, we saw the beginning of sin and all the troubles of this life that came along with it. Then we saw the beginning of God's plan of salvation and redemption. We saw the beginning of the nation of Israel, God's chosen people through whom He would begin to work out His plan of salvation and redemption. And one thing that we have seen consistently is how God patiently and mercifully and faithfully continues to work out His plan through His people, even though they so often don't live like they're the people of God. That's something we see consistently throughout the Bible, and it's something that we continue to see in our own lives today. So we have Jacob, or now Israel as he's known, and he's become an old man and he's about to die, so he gathers all of his sons to himself so that he can give them his blessing. Now in the Old Testament, the blessing of a father often contained things like words of encouragement, details of the inheritance for each son, and words of prophecy for what the future of each son was going to look like. In chapter 48, Jacob begins by blessing Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Jacob's favorite son, Joseph. Now in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, we're told that when Jacob did this, when he blessed them, he did it by faith. Think about it, they were still in Egypt, even though God had made all these promises about the land. But Jacob had come to learn by now that God always keeps His word, and so he had no doubt that God would keep His promise to bring His people back into the land, just like He said He would. It's also clear from Jacob's blessing that he intended for the covenant promises of God to be continued through Ephraim and Manasseh. He says, "May they be called by my name, and by the names of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth." That was Jacob's idea, but God had His own ideas. And in chapter 49, in the midst of his blessings of all the other sons, he blesses Judah in a way that proved to be very prophetic. Jacob had distinguished Joseph from the other brothers, but he says that Judah will be the one who rules in Israel. Verse 8 says Judah will be the one to deliver them from their enemies. He says that all of the other sons will bow before Judah. He says in verse 10 that kings will come from Judah until the coming of him to whom it belongs. In other words, until the coming of the true king. Looking ahead to Jesus, the Lion of Judah, the King of all kings. Everything that God began in Genesis is ultimately pointing ahead to its fulfillment in Christ. Then in chapter 50, Genesis ends with one final assurance that God will not fail to keep His promises. Jacob dies, and when Jacob dies, the brothers of Joseph get a little nervous that now Joseph might want to take revenge on them for what they had done to him. So they make up a story. They say, "Hey Joseph, when Dad died, he said to make sure that we tell you, Joseph, be sure to forgive your brothers for what they did to you." As if Jacob wouldn't have told that to Joseph himself. Well, Joseph sees what they're trying to do, and he assures his brothers that God is up to something much bigger than Joseph. He says, "Am I God?" In other words, the destiny of God's people is not in my hands, it's in God's hands. And then he makes a statement that sums up the continual faithfulness of God in the midst of a people who are so often faithless. He says in verse 20, "What you did, you meant for evil, but God meant it for good." And Genesis was only the beginning. As children of God, through faith in Jesus Christ, we can be absolutely certain that this same promise-keeping God is mercifully and patiently and faithfully at work to fulfill His promises in His people today.